Chinese mainland airlines cancelled almost 180 Spring Festival flights from the mainland to the island of Taiwan after Taiwan authorities rejected the added flights. How will the rejection affect cross-strait relations? And U.S. President Donald Trump pledged to modernize and rebuild the U.S. nuclear arsenal. How much is this a departure from international non-nuclear proliferation efforts? Welcome to The Point. Live from Beijing, I'm Liu Xin. 176 round-trip flights from the Chinese mainland to Taiwan scheduled over the Spring Festival or the Lunar Chinese New Year were cancelled on Tuesday, affecting an estimated 50,000 passengers, mostly Taiwanese business people planning to go back to Taiwan to reunite with their families for the holiday. Now, Chinese mainland's Eastern Airlines and Xiamen Airlines announced the cancellation after Taiwanese authorities rejected their request on Monday, citing concerns about a M03 route that the flights plan to use. The route runs close to the so-called center line of the Taiwan Strait. Taiwan authorities accused Beijing of taking unilateral action in adding the flights and harming their air safety. So why would Taiwan authorities make such a move and affect the homecoming trips of so many people, and how will this affect cross-strait relations? Joining me in the studio for the discussion is Mr. Gregory Yingnien Tsang, current affairs commentator. Mr. Tsang, thank you very much for joining us for the program. First of all, why would the Taiwanese authority not approve the use of these airlines for the route M503?
The Taiwan authorities have given at least two reasons on the surface, which may or may not be true. Number one is these flights are scheduled to fly back and forth across Taiwan Strait would use a part of the route M503. And that route, claimed by Taiwan authorities before it's initiated, there was no prior consultation given to the field. This is sort of a disruption of the proper procedures. Second concern they have is air traffic safety, claiming that the flight across Taiwan Strait added by these two airlines may interfere with the safety of the existing flights from Xiamen and Mazu back to Taiwan, back and forth. Of course, that explanation can hardly be established with good reason at all.
So explain a little bit more about the M503 route that is particularly controversial, it seems here. For instance, there are reports say, let's take a look at the map, that this route is just 4.8 miles in the closest point to the center line of the Taiwan Strait. What is so significant about this route? I understand that in the past, actually, the route has already been in use, but only for flights flying from north to south. What is the difference this time in the proposal?
Well, actually, this is not only not a new route, but also started back in 2007, designed by the Chinese side, mainland side, also consulted with the United States, with many other neighbor nations in the area. So that was a good design. Of course, later in 2015, the International Civil Aviation Organization approved the whole procedure. So it's firmly backed by legal reasons, and it's safe to fly. And this time, however, I think Taiwan administration sort of nitpicking, seeing that the flight to Taiwan would use part of the 507, that is a violation of the understanding that the Taiwan side would accept. So I think in the long run, when they put the truth on the table, they'll prove this excuse to reject the additional flights to fly to Taiwan to allow Taiwanese to return to their home island to enjoy reunion with the families is the first priority. So this is what happened, as I understand.
What was in the mind of Taiwanese leader Tsai Ing-wen? Let us try to understand her reason, because obviously she will understand the consequence that by rejecting these flights, she is denying the additional opportunities for these business people to come home with greater convenience and greater availability of flight tickets to their family for this very important family holiday. Why was she thinking?
I think Tsai Ing-wen has taken a calculated risk, thinking that by rejecting the applications from China is more helpful to her than otherwise. She might have, for example, motives behind this move. For example, Tsai Ing-wen's performance in Taiwan has been poor. Therefore, the pulling of the approval rate is going down the drain. So she would use this incident as a way to divert attention of people in Taiwan. That's number one. Mm-hmm. Second, she might take this action to tell the people in Taiwan that she's a strong leader. She's not yielding easily to the pressure coming from Taiwan. By taking this stand, perhaps they would attract more votes coming on her side for the Green candidates, for example, before the end of this mayor's election, and 2 years from now, the general election. Mm-hmm. So this could have a very multiple hidden reasons to do the job. So it's a risk she's planning to take, thinking that is good for her in the long run.
So at the cost possibly of the family reunion time of some of these Taiwanese business people. Another report, or some other reports, have pointed to the possibility that by raising this issue, the Taiwanese authority might have wanted to force the mainland authority to sit down and consult with them over the terms of these flights. Why would they want to do that?
Well, I think, as I mentioned earlier, Tsai Ing-wen is betting on taking the action, even though many travelers would not be able to return to Taiwan for holiday reunion with the families. But she blamed mainland China first. Therefore, her response is like a reaction to something initiated on the mainland side. So if those travelers cannot fly back to Taiwan for the reunion, they would perhaps, in most cases, blame mainland China has taken the first move to make this happen. So this is her a part of her calculation for sure.
Mm-hmm. But also, it is speculated maybe she also wants to open a channel of discussion, of consultation, or even possibly negotiation with the mainland, because since she refused to acknowledge the 1992 consensus, which stipulates that there is only one China, the official consultation channels has been broken.
You're absolutely right. Since 2016, she took over the administration in Taiwan. She insisted on rejecting 92 consensus and also one China principle. Therefore, the reaction from China is to cut off official communications between the SEF and the ARATS. So the official channel is broken off. So this time, Tsai Ing-wen would perhaps, a part of her motives to do the job is to force mainland side to reopen the official channels of communication, saying that if we have no kind of communication, we cannot settle the dispute. So by creating this disturbance, this sort of a unhappy event to force hand, but I don't think that approach would work out.
So first, creating this issue that needs to be discussed, and then knowing that the mainland would probably not agree to discuss. So anyway, it is all the mainland's fault that these business people cannot come back to Taiwan for their family. How has the mainland mainland authority reacted to this? Is there any possibility that under the current political atmosphere across the strait that the mainland would agree to sit down with
Just a few days ago, the TAO spokesperson, Taiwan Affairs Office and the State Council, Ma Xiaoguang, had a conference, reporters' conference. He explained thoroughly, the reasons why China has taken this stand, and why it's reasonable, for Taiwan to blame China's action at this point. So I think in the long run, through further development, I'd like to see things would change for the better, because by blaming mainland China didn't have a prior consultation or to initiate this particular route has a safety concerns, cannot really stand the tests. So this is a crisis to some extent. But in China, we say a crisis is also a time to have new opportunities, new door opened.
Right.
So I like to see that on the Taiwan side, China would not 因小失大, aiming for something small and lose the big picture. So I still have hope. I'm optimistically cautious to what's happened next.
Okay, but she also said, for instance, in a tweet on January the 4th, that recent unilateral actions by China, including the M503 flight route and increased military exercises, are destabilizing. She seems to put these two things in the same category, thinking these are destabilizing factors for relations. Do you think, given that kind of rhetoric, we can still hope for
You're absolutely right, because Tsai Ing-wen made a public statement early this month, claiming that China has intensified its military exercises by airplanes, ships and so on circling the island. So this could be a reason for her to put everything together, by rejecting the application from mainland side to let people know her displeasure of the other pressure upon her. But in the long run, any dispute should be solved by reasonable approaches, not one-sided rejection or one-sided blow out of the steam and so on. So I'd like to see things happen in the future, be able to solve to the satisfaction on both sides across Taiwan Strait.
Sure. For those business people, are there anything being done to help make up the availability that has been taken away from them because of the cancellation of the flights?
Mainly China has declared black and white other alternatives to be provided. For example, encourage range travelers to go through Hong Kong, go through Macau, or go through Xiamen for that purpose. But those routes are always available. I'm afraid without adding more direct flights across Taiwan Strait would not help in the long run. So I think Chinese side is doing its very best to facilitate the visitors on mainland China to return to Taiwan for sure.
Thank you very much, our guest, Gregory Yingnien Tsang, current affairs commentator. And here is my first point. To beat your own child in order to punish others, that's what some Taiwan people have described the decision of the Tsai Ing-wen administration. But it doesn't seem to be a surprise, as she has been refusing to recognize that there is only one China. It seems it is not her concern whether Taiwanese business people working on the mainland can return in the most convenient fashion for the most important holiday of the year for all Chinese people. But the people affected have realized that her policies do not benefit them. As poll numbers have suggested, what the Taiwan authorities believe could be a small gesture of punishment for the mainland will only turn out to be a punishment for the ruling party. And you're watching The Point with me, Liu Xin. We'll take a short break and we'll be back right after this. In his State of the Union address, U.S. President Donald Trump pledged to modernize and rebuild the U.S. nuclear arsenal, making U.S. nukes so strong and powerful so as to deter any aggression. A comment came days before the Pentagon is expected to release its Nuclear Posture Review, or NPR. A leaked draft of the document calls for building so-called low-yield nuclear weapons, which could be used against foreign aggressors, not just in response to a nuclear strike, but also potentially to a cyber attack. These plans have caused alarm among many at home in the U.S. and abroad. Why is President Trump breaking U.S.'s non-proliferation promises? Is his decision bucking international trends? Does Trump have just cause for expanding the arsenal and its use? I'm joined from Washington, D.C. by Professor Dennis Wilder, a special assistant to former U.S. President George W. Bush, and in Beijing we have Professor Fan Jishe, Director for the Institute of American Studies at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. Professor Wilder, why did President Trump make a special mention of the nuclear arsenal in his State of the Union address on Wednesday?
Well, as you alluded to, the President was setting up for the release, which I believe will occur tomorrow, of the Nuclear Posture Review. In that review, the United States is going to make the case that modernization of the U.S. nuclear weapon force is necessary now because actually the arms control process has stalled, unfortunately. And the United States postponed many of these decisions for many years. But with the Russians unwilling to move forward on these talks, we now have to think about how we modernize our force. After all, our B-52 bombers are a 1950s technology. Our Minutemen III silo-based missiles are a 1970s technology. Our ballistic missile submarines are aging. And so this is a logical step forward for the United States in its self-defense.
Professor Fang, coming from the Chinese perspective, how does China perceive the U.S.'s plan, or President Trump's plan, to modernize and rebuild its nuclear arsenal? Will China, for instance, be forced to follow suit?
I think to modernize is something, well, acceptable to many nuclear powers, since that you need to make sure the nuclear arsenal is secure, safe, and reliable. So modernization is one way to make sure the nuclear weapon is good, in good state. But to build up its nuclear arsenal is another story. That means you are going to make nuclear weapons more important in your national security strategy. That will alarm other countries. Other countries will think about what kind of implications for them. So they may take some measure to respond in kind. So that would be something bad. But as in the case of China, China policy has been remain unchanged for several decades, since October 1964, when we did the first test and we articulated our policy, and that policy remained largely unchanged for since then. So I do not believe that China will change our nuclear policy in a sudden, just to respond President Trump's rhetorics.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's take a look at those circumstances China has promised, under which China would use nuclear weapons if ever. However, the most heated word that we have seen from this leaked document, Professor Wilder, is low-yield weapons. Exactly what is so important about this term, and what is the Pentagon's argument for their for improving these kind of weapons?
Well, of course, we're going to have to wait to see the actual document tomorrow before we know exactly how this subject is discussed. This is a departure, and it's one that many Americans are uncomfortable with. The notion being that the United States should build and deploy weapons of 10 to 20 kilotons, useful supposedly in situations where you don't want to get into a full nuclear war, but you want to be able to respond to circumstances. Now, one of the problems with this is that allegedly the Trump administration is going to advocate that such weapons could be used in such situations as a major cyber attack on the United States. I think a lot of us in the national defense community in Washington here on both the Republican and Democratic side are very uncomfortable with that notion. As Secretary Shultz, former Secretary of State Shultz, said in testimony last week on the Hill, nuclear weapons are nuclear weapons, and when you begin to use them, the danger of escalation is huge. So I think this is going to be debated here in Washington. I don't think it's a done deal that we are going to deploy these kinds of low-yield weapons.
Mm-hmm. Because you were the former special assistant to former U.S. President George W. Bush, I would like to know, do you think that President Trump's announcement, his plan, is a departure to what President George W. Bush's plan on nuclear weapons, or a continuation and further development?
The modernization of the force, as the professor said, is a logical step and a stable step that is part of the American tradition in terms of our view on nuclear weapons. The low-yield nuclear weapon, no recent American administration has supported this. This is a major departure in American foreign policy. and nuclear policy, and that's why I think it will be debated here in Washington quite vigorously. Remember that the Congress has to approve funding for new programs, and the Congress is already asking serious questions about whether this is a destabilizing decision. So again, I think that we are going to have a vigorous debate on this, and I think that one of the reasons Washington or the Trump administration is looking at this is because of some dangerous Russian thinking about being able to use tactical nuclear weapons in a war without escalation. They call it escalate to de-escalate. I think the logic of that is very flawed, and I hope that neither side is going to take seriously the notion that you can use limited strikes of nuclear weapons.
Professor Pan, hearing what Professor Wilder has just said, what is China's stance on the use of nuclear weapon? You mentioned these promises that China has kept. How does China plan to react to what Professor Wilder described about the Russian approach, which is to escalate in order to de-escalate?
I believe those rhetorics are really alarming. You know, when we talk about low yield, it's another category. When we talk about nuclear, we are talking about whether it's usable or not. If you are talking about it's usable, that means, you know, you are lower the threshold for the use of the mass destructive weapons, especially, you know, for nuclear. We can think about 7 decades ago, when the nuclear bomb was dropped in Hiroshima. You know, the city was wiped out. So it's not about the use or not, but for China, our policy is that it's not usable. We truly believe that nuclear can only be used to deter nuclear attack and to retaliate nuclear attack. It's not very much like a weapon for warfighting, those things like that. So Chinese position is basically that nuclear is not usable at all.
Well, again, there has been a global trend towards nuclear non-proliferation and also disarmament. I understand that in 2017, at the United Nations General Assembly session, over 120 countries voted to negotiate a legally binding instrument to prohibit nuclear weapons. Professor Wilder, how much is President Trump's decision a departure from that international trend to move away from nuclear weapons eventually?
Well, I think that the Trump administration and every administration in the United States believes that we should move toward nuclear disarmament. But the realities of today are that the Russians are not ready to continue the nuclear arms limitation talks. They have violated the INF treaty by putting a new missile in the field that has category of use and range that is in violation of that treaty. So I have to say that I think the Russians are the ones who have taken a step back from non-proliferation, not the United States. The United States is reacting to what the Russians are doing at the moment. And if you look at the new National Posture Review, Nuclear Posture Review, you will see that it spends much more time talking about Russia than about China.
Well, the reason why we have a Chinese guest is not because we think that we are the reason why the United States is strengthening its nuclear arsenal. But Professor Pan, what is your response here? How can countries, especially major countries, help to contribute to the international disarmament process instead of making it more difficult?
Well, the big nuclear powers have a big role to play. Especially for Russia and the United States. The nuclear arsenal is about 90% of the worldwide nuclear weapons. So they have a major responsibility to play. That is to, you know, deep curse the nuclear arsenal to further reduce the number, reduce those operational deployed nuclear weapons, and to retire the weapons and to dismantle the weapons rather than to build up. Especially for the United States. In the past, the United States had been played a major role in promoting nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation. If the U.S. want to build up its nuclear arsenal when it has a major, you know, advantage in conventional nuclear weapon capability, how can U.S. to convince other countries to give up nuclear weapons, and how can the U.S. Convince other, potential proliferators like people nowadays people are talking about Iran and DPRK. If you want to keep that and you want to build it up and you want to use that, so other countries will not be willing to give up the option of nuclear weapons. So I do not think that's a responsible action for the United States to take.
Professor Wilder, you have about 20 seconds. You want to respond to this?
Well, Secretary Mattis, I understand, will be coming to Beijing in the spring. I think this is an excellent topic for discussion. I think we haven't had enough discussion between the United States and China on the nuclear questions, on strategic trust in this area. So I'm very hopeful that during his visit we can move that dialogue forward, because I think that's the only way that we are going to move toward non-proliferation in this world.
Thank you very much. We have to leave it there. Professor Dennis Wilder, Special Assistant to former U.S. President George W. Bush, and Professor Fan Jishe from the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. And my last point, in the past several years, the development in nuclear weapons issue around the world has made the prospect of nuclear disarmament more gloomy. Against this backdrop, President Trump's intention to modernize and rebuild the nuclear arsenal is likely to make things worse. If President Trump's words translate into action and policies, the consequences could be far-reaching in negative terms. But he would argue that it is in America's national interest, national security interest, to do so. But the reactions from other countries concerned might turn out to be against America's interest. That is all for this edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin. As always, follow me on Facebook or Twitter using the handle The Point with LX. Download the application called CGTN to watch our show on your mobile devices, or go to YouTube and look for CGTN The Point. Thanks for watching. You've got The Point.